I've got Robert Levy with me, and he's going to talk about the top three stories that the market's paying attention to this week. Rob, what do you want to start with?
Well, you've got to start with, Victor, in Canada this week we got some numbers that Canadian household debt is now bigger than the size of our economy.
Well, and the two sides of that, I guess, are not only how much we are how deep we're getting into debt, but how much money we're making, whether or not we can service that debt. So far, that seems to be not a problem.
That's exactly the case. And the numbers on their own, I mean, we get them every quarter from Stats Canada, and on their own they are a little boring because they don't really mean much to the individual person. They're an average of the average Canadian. On average, $1.68 in credit market debt for every dollar of disposable income. But you really nailed on the key point is we're continuing to grow our debt load, but in Canada, it's just we're not seeing incomes keep pace. We're not seeing GDP growth keep pace with how we're racking on more and more debt. And that's going to become what really worries officials at the Bank of Canada. There's one in particular, Carolyn Wilkins, who's the deputy governor to Stephen Polo's. She was talking about that this week. They just don't have in their forecast, any upbeat for Canadian economic growth, and it could potentially be a problem down the road because Canadians, they're growing the debt side of the equation, they're not growing their incomes.
Well, you use that word problem, and it calls to mind for me that something Dennis Gartman said so many times over the years. It's not a problem until it's a problem, and then it's really a problem. and that's always the way I look at it. I mean, I see two sides of a balance sheet. On the one side, you got the assets. The other side, you got the debt. And so long as you got balance, then you're fine. But if the asset side starts to fall for some reason, or in this case, income starts to fall, the debt doesn't, and then you got a problem. What's your second story?
Hey, the second one, I think we got an update from the Ministry of Finance, BC Ministry of Finance this week on our provincial budget, and I think there's a need for some cautious optimism because on the whole, I mean, the numbers look pretty good. BC is in great shape. We're the only province that has the AAA credit rating from both Moody's and Standard & Poor's, and Mike DeYoung came out and said instead of $264 million surplus, BC is going to have a $1.9 billion surplus, but I think there's got to be a little cautious optimism around his numbers.
Of course, these are always forecasts, and, who knows what the future is going to hold. Certainly, when you look at BC, and I think we've had people move to the province, there's been net immigration here. The economy seems to be strong, but the question mark keeps coming back to the housing market. And, of course, Robert, if you heard, we're going to do two segments on real estate on today's show because it just seems to be so important. You have to think that a lot of the guys that are and gals that are working out there paying taxes are in some way or other working in the real estate business, and if that cools, then maybe some of that projected revenue they're going to get from the real estate, not just the tax on the foreign taxes, that's relatively small compared to the tax that they get from every time a house gets sold. I mean, that's a big number, right?
You're exactly correct, and it's those property transfer taxes that has now become, and it's projected to be the BC government's biggest source of revenue. And when you think about it, I mean, what's fueling this province, and can it be sustainable? Because income receipts from property transfer taxes is now the biggest source of revenue at $2.2 billion. That's what it's projected to be, and that's bigger than the $1.8 billion that the government receives from our five biggest resource sectors combined. So you've now got housing. I mean, some economists are predicting the housing market in BC makes up to 35 to 40% of the BC economy, and that just speaks to vulnerabilities.
Wow. Actually, Robert, those numbers are worth repeating. I mean, you sent me some notes here, and I looked at that the tax from home sales are estimated to be bigger than the combined revenues from the tax on mining, energy, forestry, crown land tenure, and natural gas. And you're saying it's roughly 35% of the economy. So obviously when we say, is the housing market, and we all know it's been on a tear to the upside in terms of prices, if there is some vulnerability, that is going to have ramifications for the entire province and everybody that works in it and the government as well. Let's go to your top story.
The top story, Victor, is just it's all this chatter going on in the market right now, 25 basis point hike. Is it September or December? We got to get to the point of the markets, I think, have to get over it. Who cares about a 0.25% hike in interest rates? What's the trend going to be? And as I've heard you talk about many times, and it's my view too, I just don't think, they may hike once, but they're not going much higher.
Well, we're going to have our Governor of the Bank of Canada, Stephen Poloz, is scheduled to talk on Tuesday. And the title of his speech, I believe, is Lower for Longer, if that doesn't tell you a lot. And, of course, this week ahead, I know we have the Federal Reserve is going to have their meeting, and it's the will they, won't they moment about will they raise interest rates by a quarter. And as you say, or Martin Muirnfield likes to say, who cares about a quarter of a point? What difference is that going to make? But we also have the Bank of Japan out scheduled to have their meeting this week. They went to negative interest rates here a month or two back, about 2 or 3 months back, pardon me. That seemed to backfire. So, as we've talked on Money Talk so many times, the markets are so focused on central bank policy all around the world that it's almost comical, or again, Dennis Gartman would say, it would be funny if it wasn't so sad. So what are you seeing then? Are you expecting no rate hike this week, or who knows?
I don't think we're seeing a rate hike from the Fed this week, because the final governor who spoke before their lockup period, when they can't talk to media anymore, made it pretty clear that they're looking for more of an uptick in the U.S. economy. So it's going to go down the road, I think, to December, in my view. But even if we go 0.25%, and there's the minute possibility it'll be a shock, but then the markets are going to get over it, because from there, the Fed doesn't have room to move rates that much higher, especially, as you said, the dynamics that are going on around the world. How much higher can they go in the U.S.? And I think that's the bigger picture.
Well, I know we'll get into that with Dennis Gartman to some degree. We're going to talk about the currency markets, and one of the things that has made me sort of U.S. dollar bullish, and not that the U.S. dollar is perfect, but, it's just the prettiest currency in the ugly contest here, is the fact that the American economy seems to be relatively stronger. The interest rates are higher there, and that's a big function of how currency traders price in the markets. Robert, listen, thanks for taking the time to visit with us this morning. And you may be back next week, or is Michael still going to be on holiday? Do we know?
You got me for 2 more.
Excellent.